Hello, just a brief introduction from me, which you don't need to interpret. I'm going to be talking to you about the phenomenon of homeschooling. So parents taking their children out of the school system and educating them at home. And I'm going to talk about specifically the United States. I'll mention one organization, the HSA, the Home School Authority, and two Republican presidents, Donald Trump and George W. Bush. So, if you're ready, I'll now begin. Ladies and gentlemen, we've all faced a whole host of unexpected challenges over the last weeks and months of the COVID crisis. But I have to say that I'm particularly grateful for having escaped one of those challenges, namely having to teach my children from home. Because although I have three children, they're all in their 20s, and therefore I've been spared what many friends and colleagues have told me was a really trying period. And certainly it's only anecdotal evidence, but most of my friends with particularly primary school children spent most of the crisis longing for the time when their children could return to school in person. However, I'm not going to talk to you about homeschooling in the time of COVID. Rather, I'm going to talk to you about a far more institutionalized phenomenon, rather homeschooling in the United States of America. Now, I don't know what flashes through your mind if I talk to you about education and the United States. I think the first thing I would think of would be the outstanding universities in the States. I think in all the rankings, the top 10 universities, always at least 7 or 8 of them are American. And yet at the same time, it appears that in the United States, 1 child in 20 is removed from the public education system so that it can be educated at home by its parents. Now, figures are by definition approximate, and the Home School Authority has offered one set of statistics which are roughly double the numbers made available by the US Department of Education. But of course, both sides doubtless see it in their interests either to talk up or talk down the actual number of figures. But there's plenty of evidence that there is a real market for homeschooling, and it's growing. We can see this quite simply, first of all, from the large numbers of homeschooling materials, which can now be purchased on the internet. Furthermore, just about every American university now has a specific admission program for children who've been schooled at home. And most decent-sized towns now have their own homeschooling network. In other words, they get together and organize sports teams or science labs for the different children being educated at home. Now, I have to say, I find all of this absolutely astounding, and I say that for 2 reasons. First of all, deciding to school your children at home represents an enormous parental commitment, not least of all in financial terms. Not only do you lose out on the opportunity of your child receiving an education free of charge in the public system, but of course, a family will also forego one parent's income, because one of the parents, 99 times out of 100, the mother, I imagine, will stay at home in order to bring the children up. But I also find this phenomenon astounding because it really calls into question all of my assumptions about the value of public education. In the West, we have had compulsory mass education for a century and a half or more. And I've always seen that as a real sign of progress, of civilization indeed. And yet here we have a country like the United States of America, where a substantial number of parents are deciding to opt out of the system altogether. Now, just to give you a little bit of history, 40 years ago, homeschooling officially did not exist because it was illegal in just about every one of the federal states. Whereas today, I think it's legal in every state, although the conditions do vary from state to state. In some cases, children have to undergo regular appraisal and testing to make sure that they're keeping up. Whereas in some states, it's enough for the parents to inform the local authorities that they're withdrawing their child. And in some states, it's not even necessary for parents to do that. The child can just stop going to school. And what's become particularly clear over the last 10, 15 years or so is that there's one main driver behind this phenomenon, and that is what I would call the Christian right wing. A group of people, a substantial group of people in the United States, who have a perception that society in general, and schooling in particular, is shifting towards the left, and is above all taking on a more secular nature, and effectively, they say, turning its back on God and Christianity. So with that in mind, it's perhaps no surprise to know that the vast majority of parents who school their children at home are staunch Republican supporters. President Trump has organized various receptions in the White House for homeschoolers. And I remember some 15, 20 years ago reading an article in The Economist which described homeschoolers as George W. Bush's secret army. However, I think it's not fair to suggest that people are taking this decision on ideological grounds. I believe, I hope, that if parents decide to remove their children from the public school system, it's because they're convinced that this will give their children the best possible opportunities. And one can clearly see a number of arguments in favour of homeschooling. There's an obvious pedagogical argument. If you're dealing on a one-on-one basis, then it makes it much easier to adapt the pace of the learning process to the abilities of the child. A particularly gifted child will be allowed to advance more quickly. One who is struggling will be given more time to fully absorb and master the subjects being taught. It's also, as I mentioned before, increasingly easy to find high-quality teaching materials on the internet. This at a time when many schools are seeing their budgets being cut back radically. And of course, success breeds success. The more children who are educated at home, the easier it is to organise the joint initiatives I mentioned, like sports teams and science labs. And that, of course, avoids one of the biggest potential risks of homeschooling, namely isolation. However, there is, of course, one crunch question. Does it work? Do children who are schooled at home have a higher academic standard? Well, here too, frustratingly enough, I don't have a clear answer to give you. The Homeschooling Authority produced a survey a year or two back saying that 3/4 of children taught at home managed to get into an American university, and that's substantially higher than the national average. But that, to my mind, only tells part of the picture. Firstly, if a child hasn't got into university, there's absolutely no obligation on the parents to report that fact. But above all, as I indicated before, it's the most affluent families who are able to school their children at home, who can afford for one parent not to earn income, and that sort of background would naturally tend to produce better academic results. So clearly, to conclude, the phenomenon is very well entrenched in the United States. But I can't help wondering whether, like so many trends and fashions, it'll just be a matter of time before it crosses the Atlantic and comes to Europe. However, I have to say, having spoken to my friends and colleagues and having heard about what a trial homeschooling has been, I suspect it'll be some time yet before it catches on our side of the Atlantic. Thank you very much.